Okay, another question here. This comes from Tom in Middlebury, Connecticut. It's about how we judge draft picks. Hey, Mary Kay, do you and Dan tend to be overly optimistic when it comes to draft picks, or do you tend to be spot on in your post draft evaluations through the years? I cut some of that question out. He was asking sort of how we used to view, like how did you view the Gilbert pick, the Manziel pick, the Garrett pick, things like that. But I think it's an interesting question about how, like, in the moment, do we view these draft picks and how do we try to judge some of these draft picks? Because I just have an approach that I try to stick with when it comes to you. When the Browns make a pick like Cedric Tillman, how do you try to evaluate that pick?
Well, with a guy like Cedric Tillman, I look at the size, I look at the production, I look at those 12 touchdown catches. I take into account what he's like when we interview him. You can often tell during that first interview what they're going to be like. We interview differently than teams do. We ask questions a team might not ask. And that's what we do for a living. And so I think sometimes we can draw some things out that might give you a little insight into a player and their mentality and their psyche and how they're going to handle things. But he's passing the eyeball test for me so far. He's passing the background test in terms of, what he's been able to produce so far. Good bloodlines. We know his dad was an NFL receiver, so he's got the athleticism, that's genuine. So I put a lot of things into the hopper when I try to figure out if I am on board with a pick or not. Sometimes when we talk about the eyeball test, we judge a person by their physical appearance. And teams do that too. It's not just us. And sometimes we can tell right away they don't pass the eyeball test. Now, that doesn't mean that can't change. Cedric did, by the way, pass the eyeball test. Some don't. And that doesn't mean they can't change, right? I mean, we've seen guys come in and change their physical bodies, but there's been other guys where it's like, uh-oh, he doesn't look like a football player, right? I mean, it's so bizarre that you can get to this point in the draft and it's like, wait a minute, that guy doesn't look like what I expect an athlete to look like. So there's some of that goes on, but let me just say with Cedric Tillman, I have a really good feeling about him.
Yeah, the eyeball test is always interesting, especially when we get to see him on the field for the first time. Like, that's always kind of fun to get your eyeballs on somebody, and especially if it's somebody who's like a JOK, who we knew who was smaller, like a different body type, to kind of get eyeballs on a guy like that and see how he looks. And I was just thinking about this guy today because the Browns gave a pretty big guarantee to, and I don't have the name in front of me, but to a linebacker this year, an undrafted free agent. And It got me thinking of a few years ago. Do you remember the name Marvin Wilson?
Yes.
So the Browns gave at the time, it was a pretty sizable guarantee to him in 21, I think it was.
Yeah.
And so I was like kind of excited to see Marvin Wilson in practice. And then I saw him like run through the bags. And I was like, oh, I don't know about this. You kind of see if guys look stiff or if they look natural. And so there's some of that. One of the things that to really answer Tom's question is, like, in the moment, I try not to be like, I don't ever want to look at a player and be like, oh, that's a terrible pick to pick that player. I try to kind of focus on the process and, like, is this the position, like the Dorian Thompson-Robinson pick, right? I've been a little critical of them maybe taking a quarterback there, but not of the player. I actually think he's an interesting player. So I try to not pass judgment on the players themselves until, we actually can see them on the field and see how they play and see how they look, because I think it can be unfair sometimes to a kid, the minute he gets drafted, to say, well, that's a terrible pick. That guy's not going to be any good, because there's just so much that goes into it.
Yeah, there is so much that goes into it. But I mean, after you've been doing this for so long, you start to develop some instincts about whether, a guy, has what it takes mentally, whether he loves the game of football. I think that's important. I think that's really, really important. You kind of have to be a little bit of a gym rat, not a little bit of a gym rat. You have to be a gym rat at this stage of the game, to really be good, because it takes so much heart and soul. This is not college where, you can put part-time effort in and still be good. And then the eyeball test, I think the reason why we're able to see some different things when they get here on the grass is because you're comparing them to NFL players. And at any other point, they have been compared to college players. And so you get them here and you can see pretty quickly how they stack up physically, speed wise, strength wise. I mean, when you watch the defensive linemen going through the bags, you can see certain things and you can pick up certain things. And you can kind of get a feel for who's got what it takes and who might struggle. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we're usually pretty close to being spot on. If we get really concerned about a guy early on, I think there's been plenty of times, Dan, where that guy, did struggle to make it. And yeah, I think I would have to say, I mean, I think after all these years, we have a pretty good eye.
Yeah, you kind of know what you're looking at.